It's time to accelerate. Hi, I'm your host, Andy Paul. Join me as I host conversations with the leading experts in sales, marketing, sales automation, sales process, leadership, management, training, coaching, any resource that I believe to help you accelerate the growth of your sales, your business, and most importantly, you. Hello and welcome to Accelerate. You're back with us on Frontline Friday with my regular and special guest, Bridget Gleason. Bridget, how are you today?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you, Andy?
Good. Warming up a little bit. We had a cold spell here in New York this past weekend, and minus 15 wind chill and, things that are probably normal to other parts of the country, but it was cold. So it's nice to have it warm up a little bit.
And you said the swing was quite dramatic in just a couple of days.
Yeah, 50, 60, maybe even 70 degree swing in a couple of days. So yeah, it's still not summer, but it's...
keeps things interesting for you.
It keeps things interesting, yeah. Yeah, it's nice. What it's doing is it's keeping all the bad weather until I get here. So I've been traveling a lot. I've been California a lot and other places. And so Snowmageddon, when we had the huge snowstorm a few weeks ago, waited till I very nicely and patiently till I got back in town to do that. And same with the cold weather.
Andy?
Yes.
Some may say that you're bringing it to the East Coast, so be careful. I'd be careful about that correlation.
Yeah. Well, the doorman in my building accused me of that yesterday morning. It's like, hey, every time you come back.
Stay away.
Yeah, that's right. Every time you come back, you bring this bad weather with you.
Stay away.
Yeah. Well, there's a solution to that, but I will talk about that another time. So today, I thought we'd talk about is a topic that had seen some interesting blog post about, which was, are we setting up SDRs, our sales development reps, are we setting them up for failure? And I thought it was a really interesting topic. I thought we should spend some time talking about this, because it was triggered by a blog post I saw on Heinz Marketing website, a great website for people with good content if they want to check it out. And it sort of resonated because I'd had my own experience with this. So you and I were at a conference last week. We were at the same conference. I saw you speak. And, I stopped by a bunch of booths at the conference. And there was one booth in particular I stopped by and I spoke to the sales rep and a young woman who was the SDR that was manning the booth for the day. And, very specific about what my interest was in being at the booth, was just learning about them. And, once she understood who I was, what my company does, she saw that I definitely wasn't a fit for what they had, though. Here a week later, I get first a phone call and then an email from one of their other SDRs. And I assume they're using some sort of automated tool to trigger this. But I guess that was just sort of interesting. There's two things. One is obviously there wasn't any internal communications between the sales rep that had spoken to me and had scanned my badge and the one that was assigned the lead. And then secondly is, if the person the SDR who called me had just spent 30 seconds and looked at my LinkedIn profile, he would have seen I wasn't worth the time for the call or the email. So is that is an example, right, of companies that somehow, either through lack of training or lack of process or whatever, or just so much focus on quantity metrics, that are they setting up their SDRs for failure?
It's a really good topic. And I would say in a lot of situations they are. I mean, your example is a great one. And as I was listening to you, Andy, I was sort of running that through our own internal process here at SumoLogic and what we require of our SDR team. And to call every contact, and they attend our booth at a trade show, and to send them the email, and we're right now struggling a little bit that we don't have the quantity of leads that we need. So we've got a lot coming in that's like you, probably not well qualified, not someone worth reaching out to. And yet I'm sure our SDRs are still reaching out because that's what they're told to do. And just as you're listening, I feel that I'm guilty with some of this. And I think this is a really great topic. and to think how do we set them up for more success, and hence the sales team and the company up for success.
Well, I think that part of the theory seems to be operating theory that we as a sales industry are operating in this mode is that it's purely a volume thing. I mean, the writer of this blog post that we start off with referred to as sort of an analogy of what Russia did in World War II when they're fighting the invasion of the Nazi troops, is that they just kept throwing manpower at it. And it was by sheer force of numbers, not technological advantage or industrial might or anything else. It was just the willingness to sacrifice people on the altar of victory that they were able to overcome. And he was sort of drawing an analogy to what we're doing in the sales development model these days, is that it's just sheer volume. And if we have enough volume, we're going to get the growth out of it that we need. And
and that's true. We will, but there will be a lot of scorched earth, and it'll be very expensive.
And you eventually, and we sort of alluded to this in one of our last conversations, eventually you exhaust the customer base.
Oh, you do. It is a numbers game. I mean, is it in the long run, in the short term, yeah, throw bodies at it, throw resources at it, just do more of the same thing. It's going to be very expensive. You're going to burn out the SDRs, and you're going to burn out the customer base. And again, it's a short-term strategy. It's not a long-term strategy. And particularly with social media, you see it on Twitter frequently. Can you tell the SDR team at XYZ company to stop spamming me? You see it, or they'll send a note to the CEO, we get it here sometimes also. But I'll tell you, Andy, it's hard to believe, but it's true. It's why these blog posts get written, is that there is, I don't want to call it prevailing wisdom, but a prevailing school of thought that let's just keep doing more of it. And we can make it work out on a spreadsheet. That if it took, I think you and I were talking about this in our last episode. Okay, if it takes 7 to 10 touches in 2016 to get to somebody, all right, maybe in 2017 it'll take 15 touches. Go for it. And let's find tools that help us do more touches. Ultimately, it will be so interesting to see what happens here, because it's not scalable. You can get a short-term win, and at the expense of individuals, both internal and external to the company.
Yeah, ironically, you're sort of at the top of the pyramid of not just an organization, but a sort of a movement in terms of the software as a service sales model. And so, I find it interesting that we're still sort of perpetuating this, and that it seems like the moment of reckoning is coming faster than people think. And it sort of starts with sort of the problem that this gentleman talks about in this blog post, and the experience that I had is that, at the SDR level, either through a combination of pressure from above or whatever, is just the fundamentals about personalization, about research, pre-call research, and so on. See, as much as they're preached, they're really not practiced.
Yeah, I'll tell you, just internally, even at a company like SumoLogic, and we're not unusual, is the SaaS sales movement is actually relatively young. And we don't think so because you and I have been in it, but it's relatively young. And you get sales executives and you get executive leadership that comes from more traditional sales organizations that are used to a different selling model. And what I think it is, Andy, is just a lack of understanding of how the sales world has changed because of SaaS, the tools out there that can exacerbate the problem. And I think so largely it's an education issue internally to get people on the same page around what best practices are, because there's still sometimes SaaS companies that are still internally, they operate and think like a very traditional, let's say, field organization. And I think that's where some of the disconnect comes in.
Because
there's you've got maybe executive leadership that sees that doesn't get it and says they just need to do more of the same.
Got it.
And again, we'll see where you and I spend our time on the two coasts, East and West Coast. They're a little bit more progressive, but I think you go to more traditional markets and companies, will see a lot more of this. And I think this article that you're referencing is particularly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think about this whole idea of you've got SDRs being pressured to make contact, and I think about it from the SDR's perspective. It's like, because I look back at my own job, my own first job, which was similar, except it was outside, right? I wasn't inside making 50 calls a day. I was outside making 30 to 40 cold calls a day. So not too dissimilar. And yeah, there was a process. I knew what we were supposed to do, but I knew enough after beating my head against the wall to say, and maybe the expectations for success are too low for SDRs. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe if the expectations for success were higher, is they'd have to think more for themselves and say, look, this process doesn't work because it's not scalable. Maybe that's the problem. Just occurred to me. Maybe we're not asking enough of them. Maybe they shouldn't be setting up, 2 appointments a day. Maybe it should be 10 appointments a day. And if they had really forced themselves to think about what the process would be to have more success at what they're doing, that we'd start breaking out of the cycle of getting these calls from unprepared reps and really wasted calls. You have to assume that if they're not prepping to call me, then they're not prepping to call anybody.
Well, and I think that's not doing the preparation. I mean, that's I don't care when that is. That doesn't, when or who or where, that's just not acceptable. So I think that's largely a training issue.
But it seems rampant. It seems rampant, though. It doesn't seem like. I assume a lot of these companies are training. I mean, here's my idea. Here's an idea. I'm thinking about starting a Hall of Shame, where I'm going to start having people give me examples with names of companies whose SDRs are making these types of calls. I mean, it's gotten to a point where I think maybe that's an idea where we have to is we'll start a public forum. We'll stop publicly sort of shaming companies who aren't training their SDRs to do this.
Okay, I think that's going to be a really huge wall. Okay, we've got the Great Wall there. I think it's going to be a littler wall if you do the companies that aren't doing that. I think so. I have a couple of thoughts on this.
So positive reinforcement. So I have a wall of fame, and we're going to give props to the companies that are doing it right. Okay, well, that's a better idea.
Yeah, I'm much more in the fame versus shame camp, but that's just my own personal preference. So I have a couple of thoughts about this and how I see things even starting to shift in the SDR world. Is instead of measuring an SDR on calls and activities, measuring on results. What are the results we're looking for? And how do you get to those? So maybe it's qualified opportunities, maybe it's pipeline generated. So looking more at the results as opposed to just the raw activities. I think that's one. Number two, we have to remember that the people in these SDR roles, they're typically their first jobs. Mm-hmm. Not always, but oftentimes. This is often an entry-level position. With millennials also, in particular, they don't stay at jobs long. I think it's less than 18 months. So it's hard to get a proficiency also, and you've got to train them quickly so that you can get the value out of them. So, and that sounds bad too. So that
Yeah, a little bit, yes.
well, and I mean,
But I know what you mean.
part of it's true. Part of it's true. Is you
Sure.
want them to be productive. That's a better way. Is you want them to be productive before they move on to that next role, and you also want to teach them something in that 18 months.
Well, and that's a great point. That's the point I want to dive into. But actually, we're going to take a short break first, and we'll come back because I want to dive into that in terms of what we're trying to teach them and why. So we'll be right back with my guest, Bridget Gleason. Attention, sales leaders. Would you like to give your sales team the tools to drive more quality connects, scale their outreach, and spend more time selling? Well, you can with LiveHive. Get your ROI. Try it now at livehive.com/ROI. That's LiveHive, LiveHive.com/ROI. Okay, we're back with Bridget Gleason on Frontline Fridays. We're talking about, are we setting our SDRs up for failure? And Bridget was just making a great point about how we train them. So I wonder if there's a lot of turnover in SDR function. And I think that's always been the case in entry-level sales jobs, right? And people come in, they have no idea what sales is about. I mean, it's always been thus, right? They have no idea what sales is about. They get a chance to go out and, you hope they persevere through the first 6 months, get through that sort of learning curve of understanding that, sales isn't personal, that they understand rejection but people begin to, they sort themselves out during that period of time. So you expect a certain amount of turnover. But I wonder, too, whether you talked about we train people for the function, but we really don't train people for the career of being in sales. So in this early training, how much time is spent talking about, okay, how do buyers make decisions? Throw that as an example, right? How do we expose them to the psychology of how people gather information and make decisions, which is knowledge is really important for everybody, but especially people in a sales job, to understand that. And that gives them some broader context. And that's just one example, a broader context of this career and this playing field they're operating in, and whether it's something that's suitable for them. And if you do more of that, then maybe they begin to think more for themselves. And that's really what I think is one of the problems in the SDR thing is we don't reward initiative. We don't provide an incentive for individual initiative within that environment.
Yeah, I do agree with you that's a big problem, that the role is two things. The role is narrow, and so they are encouraged to focus on get the appointment, get the meeting, get the demo, get the call. That they've got blinders on. And so to your point, how do they learn beyond that? How are they going to progress to the next level with these blinders on? I think the other piece of it is, I don't know how to say this delicately, but I think sometimes the tools can make them not have to think. And I think that's a problem, is that I don't want a tool that just does everything for them, and the messages are pre-written and it tells you exactly who to send it to, and that in a way it allows them to be lazy in the role, which doesn't do them any favors. And I don't mean lazy in the sense that they're not doing other work, but there's a certain amount of thinking that goes into crafting the email and doing the research and thinking beyond just getting the appointment. To your point, what is the overall business environment that this prospect is operating under that would be very useful?
Yeah, I think it's and I think it's the difference between just doing the job versus trying to succeed.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Andy, who would want to stay in sales if it's so narrow? And I mean, I can't imagine that those individuals that are in an SDR role, if they don't have a manager or an organization that really wants to help them develop professionally, I can't imagine they'd have a very good first experience in sales. Or they may just think, okay, I just got to do my time here so I can go on to a more interesting role.
Yeah, well, I mean, and at the conference we were at, the SaaStr conference, I mean, on more than one occasion, there's this open acknowledgement that, and this is a quote, that, and being an SDR, this is brutal work, quote unquote, brutal work. And, it shouldn't be, right? It doesn't mean it shouldn't be hard and demanding, but describing it as brutal, I mean, hey, you and I both early in our careers went out and made a ton of cold calls on people. And we didn't have the ability to make them warm calls, as oftentimes you have the ability with the SDR function today. Yeah, we didn't want to do it our whole career. I mean, we didn't want to be in that entry level job forever. And so part of our challenge was, I presume you didn't do it precisely the way that was prescribed and laid out for you by your manager or the handbook. And my experience was none of the people that really succeeded, and succeeded a lot, did it that way. They all found their own way to succeed that was different than, it's still in compliance, but different with what, the standard that was laid out. And so I find that, this whole idea, let's say, of personalization, right? That was talked about in the conference and several of the sessions about, SDRs, we've got tools that can personalize this email. It's like, yeah, just putting the person's name in, that doesn't really constitute personalization, right? If they can't spend time to research the person, whether they're even a suitable fit, really what level of personalization in the messaging is really taking place?
Yeah, that is such basic, that's basic personalization. It can be done by a tool.
Right.
Like there's nothing about that is relevance. So I think it's personalization and relevance combined that are important.
Yeah. So how at the end of the day, how do you balance the quantity and the quality demands? Because right now there's not really a demand for quality. There's just a demand for quantity. I mean, there's lip service given to quality, but in my work with companies, very few of them really have a conscious focus on quality and improving the effectiveness of the SDR function in a way that's just not really relying on doing more.
Well, I think when you think about the importance of a really tight sales and marketing alignment, I think it starts all the way back with marketing. And if marketing is able to deliver more qualified leads, mm-hmm. that will enable the SDRs and fewer of them. I'd rather have fewer that are high quality that an SDR can spend some time on doing both the personalization and figuring out where there's some relevance. So I would say that's one. I think with outbound teams is having, again, same thing, the focus on let's see what we can do about doing less, but getting a better conversion rate from, be it MQL or target to opportunity, and then a better conversion rate from opportunity to close. But I think we will see, Andy, the focus shift to quality over quantity. I think we have to. I think people are fatigued with the quantity and just the volume of things coming at them. And it's much easier than ever before to filter and to not answer and caller ID and just spam filters in your inbox. It's easier to filter them out. And the only ones that are going to get through are the ones where there is some connection and there's some relevance and there's something that stands out that leads me to believe, this might be interesting to me. Because I think what we're doing is we're training prospects to ignore us because there's so much junk that comes over and solicitation that is not relevant at all to me or what I do or who I am or the role that I'm in.
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. And I think you're right. I mean, I think that it's going to become this next revolution in sales is how do we effectively shift the model from scorched earth, as you talked about before, to much more targeted. What do we use from and it could be a technology. What do we use from a data supported. I really think this is where the data comes in. How do we use the data to help us formulate messages and outreach in a way that are more effective in breaking through the noise than what we currently have today?
Yeah, and I think it's that combination of data and what a human does with it. And that's what I would hope to see in the SDR function, is that data will help them to do their jobs more effectively, and that it will be a more interesting job than just sort of a robot calling.
Yeah.
I think it'll be more interesting and will enable them to apply some of their critical thinking skills on, what is the business environment potentially for this prospect, and could what my company offers be a good match given what I've learned about them and the challenges that this individual may be having.
Right. Great. Well, it's a great way to sum it up. So I want to thank you for being on the show again today, and appreciate everybody joining us today. And we'll be back next time with another episode with my guest, Bridget Gleason, on Frontline Friday.
Have a great rest of the day, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you like what you heard and want to make sure you don't miss any upcoming episodes, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher.com. For more information about today's guest, visit my website at andypaul.com.